now going to discuss some of the questions underlying today's core idea. And the first one is the question of, is there an objective truth in the first place anyway, or is it a question of perspective? And that will then underline, I think, some of the questions of freedom that we have been discussing that we'll move on to in a moment. So, Tommy, could I start with you? Mm-hmm. Is there, in fact, an objective truth? Nice small question for a Friday afternoon.
I mean, if you mean an objective truth that's eternal, that we have knowledge of, I would say even if it did exist, we don't have the perspective or the perception of what it could be. So we can have tentative truths, like things that we posit as being probabilistically true, or things that tend not to change shape as easily as falsehoods. But that's the best that we can get to. I think that part of the issue is this claim to objective truth, the idea that we've had an absolute that only certain people can intuit or certain people can have access to is largely the problem both of our narrow disciplines, our Eurocentric education, our misunderstanding of the construction of civilization itself, ultimately the erroneous pursuits that we engage that lead us to replace, say, issues of finding truth with our most convenient political ideology of the day.
Would you, not to steal words from Kathleen's mouth, and I will in fact make sure that she gets to ask this question in her own terms in just 30 seconds, but in terms of that objective truth, is this something that's a particular problem with the social sciences and humanities, or is it something that we should be looking to all forms of knowledge, all kinds of epistemic conversation?
Well, I think when you get to some of the hard sciences, there's an understanding that scientific methodology leads to probabilistic truths, things that can be overturned with new findings. The problem in humanities, largely, this is Kant as well, right? In the idea that we're constructing and trying to pursue knowledge, often we take shortcuts because the moralization of what we take to be the right or the good supplants our methodological rigor. So I can study race, and my idea before I even look at the society is we should include and integrate everyone. Well, is that the best thing to solve racial or ethnic differences in a given society? That's not always the case. So objective truth becomes a very moralistic and politically infused idea, given the lack of rigorous testing and verifiability in the humanities and social sciences, which is something I don't think the hard sciences necessarily suffer from, because there's a kind of falsifiability in their theories.
And Kathleen, I know you're going to be speaking later on, in fact, about your book, Material Girls, but of course part of the controversy you were involved in at Sussex was the question of what can and cannot be debated as objective truth, in that case, particularly in the case of biology.
Yeah, I mean, the question's posed, I think, misleadingly. It's an opposition. There is truth, it's objective and perspectival. I mean, it's both. You're never going to get, very, very perspective neutral objectivity, because we are human beings with differing perceptual faculties. However, there are clearly some very stupid and wrong answers. We can definitely eliminate quite a lot of things. And even where you admit that truth is perspectival, it's not up to me. It's not totally arbitrary or keyed into individuals. It's shared perspectives derived through cultural or social means. So you can still find out about those, and you can try and make inferences about what contribution the social has and what contribution the natural has. And where the universities often have gone wrong in humanities is taking away the natural and thinking that everything's up for social kind of construction, and that they get to construct it, because of course it's not a coincidence that academics end up in charge of social construction if there's no such thing as reality. It puts them at the center of the universe, which is a really powerful position for them to be, or so they think. So they just get to make up loads of shit. And so we need to go back to a more constrained and reasonable social constructivism, which recognizes that there are bits of the world that we can do nothing about, and then think about how our perspectives interact with it.
Aaron, the 18th century philosopher Leopold von Ranke was unfortunately not available for the debate today. His agent wasn't returning calls. But he did put forward the idea that you could look at history as something wie es eigentlich gewesen, things as they really were. Is that actually the kind of objective reality in terms of our interpretation of the past and present that we could really aspire to? Or is that just a pipe dream?
Wow, German historiography. I didn't think I'd be... Wow.
We aim to please.
Yeah.
It's what the kids want.
Yeah, well, that's all they talk about on TikTok. I'm a Marxist, so I generally look at social existence as, the whole quote of man is a social fact. And I think the good thing with the scientific method is that it gives us a certain humility, like you say, about falsifiable data and so on, and that quote unquote fact is contingent until further exploration and new studies, and we actually learn even more. And I do think there's a certain conceit at the heart of the humanities sometimes, which doesn't have that humility for quite obvious reasons, because, like you say, it's not often testing falsifiable propositions. In terms of history, I mean, could you reformulate that? So is there a truth content to the historical process?
Actually, could I do that by just taking something you've just said? I mean, I assume if, as a Marxist, you might prefer Hegel to Rankin.
Oh, definitely.
We should really spend the entire session talking about 18th century and 19th century philosophy, because that is what the audience want. But when you said man is a social fact, again, you could immediately pick back and say, well, now we might say the human is a social fact. By changing that phrasing, what do we change about the objective reality of the social fact you want to posit?
Very good question. That's a very good question. That should mean that man is a social, humans are a social being. We are social beings, and that the forms of existence within which we find ourselves is contingent to a certain extent on what he would call the economic base. Now, I don't agree with that entirely, and I think Stuart Brand comes up with a much more powerful idea called pace layers. And this is how the historical process works. At the bottom of the pace layer is nature, very powerful layer. If that goes wrong, the rest of it collapses. It could be an extinction level event, it could be a pandemic. But then above the nature pace layer, you have culture, which is clearly contingent. It's changing and it's flexible all the time. And above that, you've got commerce, you've got governance. Of course, these change all the time too, and what they think is right. And right at the top, you have fashion, which is incredibly transient and whimsical and changes by virtue of what it is constantly. And so, for me, I would say that clearly the observing the entirety of human existence, I think, again, gives you a certain humility around, humans as a social fact. We have been around. There were humans anatomically identical to us. They were around 300,000 years ago. Identical to us. And then something very strange happens. I mean, there's some people who have revisionist views on this, but let's just stick to the science. Sorry, we're not meant to say that, but let's stick to the science. 12,000 years ago, we get the Neolithic Revolution, agriculture. And off the back of agriculture, writing, cities, mathematics, astronomy, and now we're here, 2022, electric vehicles, mobile phones, the internet. So clearly, I am very hesitant for people to categorize and box what it is to be human, when clearly we've changed so dramatically. That's the essence of our humanity.
Kathleen?
Yeah, I mean, just to respond to that, it's one thing to say that we've changed, and clearly we have. But I think for me, the move from man to human was a bit of a mistake, because it plugged us in as different from everything else that lives on the planet. Like, we are not like other animals, and of course we are all animals, and we are, related to chimps and bonobos, and we have a lot of material facts about us that, especially in the Enlightenment liberal tradition, which goes along with sort of freedom as the guiding metaphor, we want to be free of all that. We don't want to be animals. We want to be in charge of our own destinies and not determined by our genes or our hormones or whatever. And that narrative in the 21st century is going bonkers, and now people want to be free of their own bodies, and they want to be free of transhumanism, all that stuff. So it's nothing wrong with, if it's just a quick transition from whatever, prehistoric to agricultural revolution, fine, but let's not forget that we are still animals.
Tommy?
Yeah, I mean, these are very difficult questions, right? Because the very notion that we have of the human that appeals to biology, right, to the dichotomy that's being created between man or human and animal, these are products of certain kinds of worldviews. These are very recent notions that didn't exist in indigenous, African, even ethnological societies in Europe in the 19th century. So if we're trying to get back to an understanding of what the human is, or the way the human moves through history, the question becomes what history and whose history? And that idea that there's somehow a universal grounding by which we could talk about the evolution and development of the human is something that I think underlies some of the nascent social constructionism today, because we're not looking at an interpretive framework. Like, think about Houston Chamberlain, for instance, right? You're not
just
dealing
tell
with
us briefly who Houston Chamberlain was.
So Chamberlain's a British guy that's a germophile that loved Nazism. But one of the interesting things about him was that he argued that the Teutonic people were the ones that were destined to rule the world, whereas, British Anglo-Saxon people thought they were the ones that were going to rule the world and bring reason. The reason that's interesting, though, is because it gives you this very same question about the failures or crises of the 20th century. Which group of people that define themselves as the original and the most insightful, having access to the truth, get to decide the fate of the world? And what I fear happens in the Western metaphysical tradition is there are multiple claims, usually ethno-racial, where people define what humanity is to the exclusion of other groups of people.
So that's a really good place to get to the second part of our discussion, which gets right to the present day and present day issues. Now,
to continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.
For more debates, talks and interviews, subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.